How do you raise bilingual children? And what are some of the do's and don'ts? In this video, I answer 4 of the most commonly asked questions. Let's start. So as I said in the introduction, in this video I will be talking about how to make your children bilingual. I don't have children myself, but I was raised bilingually by my parents and I grew up speaking French and Portuguese from day one, and I also have experiences of doing research in child language acquisition and bilingualism as part of my BA and my general university studies. The reason why I did this video is because there's a lot of misconception around how to make children bilingual. Frankly, all the points I will be making in the video are kind of common sense, but they're still ignored by a lot of people though. Before we start, have a look at the description because I will define the main keywords that I use in the video just for the sake of clarity. So the first question I will answer, and it's probably the one that most people will be interested in, is what is the best strategy to raise your children bilingually? When answering this question, a lot of people refer to the one parent, one language kind of strategy, which basically means that each parent will speak one language to the children. So for example, if in a couple there is an English and French parent, then the dad might want to only speak English to the child and the mum might only want to speak French to the child, even though both parents might have some knowledge of the 2 languages or be actually bilingual in both. The issue with this strategy, and it will make sense when I explain the second strategy, is that the children might not get enough exposure to the 2 languages. And this is why I suggest a better strategy, which is called the home versus community language strategy. This strategy has actually been discussed a lot in the literature of bilingualism, but it doesn't seem to be that popular, even though I think, to me, it makes sense. And in this strategy, there is basically one language that will be spoken in the home and one other language that will be spoken in the community. Usually that's the official language. In my opinion, the assumption is that the child doesn't need to speak the community language or the official language of the country in the home, because when he or she goes out, or even later when he or she goes to school, they will have enough exposure of the language, so they don't need to have it at home, basically. Another thing that is important with this strategy is to make sure that the weaker language, or the language that the child is the least exposed to, is also available to him or her in other aspects of their lives. What you might want to consider is to make sure that the child has opportunities to use that language, so not just at home, but also outside of the home. For example, some parents decide to put their children in international schools or bilingual schools. Or, for example, they have a community of friends that speak that language, that weaker language, so they can try to maybe have their children spend more time with these people, their children or something like that. So that can be a good way for your child to be exposed to the language. Another way, of course, can be to actually go on holiday with the child to the country where the weaker language is spoken to ensure that the child gets as much exposure as possible. Don't worry too much about the stronger language, because even if you might feel the child doesn't have enough exposure, as long as the child gets some exposure, later in life when they go to school or later in life in general, they will definitely get a lot of input from that language, so it will find its place in the end. Second question, what if one of the parents are non-native speakers? A lot of parents or people in general seem to think that if a child is exposed to non-native input, then the child might get a weird accent or they might not speak the language properly, and actually that's a big myth. For example, in my case, both my parents speak to me in 2 languages, and for example, my dad, French is not his native language, Portuguese is, and he speaks to me in French and always has. For my mum, it's a bit similar. She's Portuguese and French, but her Portuguese is quite heavily accented, and she still speaks to me in Portuguese, and my accent in Portuguese is not weird or anything, because I still had native input from my broader family back in Portugal, and my parents also had Portuguese friends, so I still had that native input with non-native input. I hope that makes sense. I would say though that if both parents try to speak to the child in a language that is not native to them or maybe not comfortable to them, then I would question whether it's a good idea to do that, because I think as a parent, maybe you might disagree. I feel like you want to speak to your child in a language that is natural to you and that is, the language of your heart. So I would kind of consider whether it's a good idea to do that, because I feel like in the end you might just end up speaking your native language to the child. I mean, it's not a black and white answer to that question, but it's something that you definitely need to consider. And I think it's important for children to really have a need for that language. So I would question whether, if you're speaking to your child in your non-native language, then they might just figure it out and then they will feel like, oh, I don't need to learn that language because mommy or daddy, they already speak another language and they might be even more comfortable with it. So in that case, if you're kind of forcing yourself to speak a language that is not natural to you, your child will pick it up. And maybe this language will just stop being spoken at home, I think. That's why need is very important. The only reason why I learned Portuguese wasn't because my parents forced themselves to speak Portuguese all the time. The reason is that I had to learn it because otherwise I wouldn't be able to communicate with my dad, who didn't speak French when he arrived in France, so I had to speak Portuguese to him in order to communicate. I also had to speak with my broader family. So all these stuff kind of triggered this need, because if I couldn't speak Portuguese, then I couldn't communicate with people around me or some people around me. So if you don't feel like you can give that native input to your child, then I would definitely advise, as I said earlier, to put that child, that poor child, in situations where they will absolutely need to use that language in order to achieve whatever they're doing, their activity or their task. Third question, are there any big don'ts to raise children bilingually? And the short answer is yes. And the longer answer is the following. Contrary to popular belief, children don't just pick up language like that. Think of it. Children get exposed to a language for many years until they actually are able to communicate freely and comfortably in that language, and until they reach linguistic maturity. In fact, they require a lot of input, repetition, and they make a lot of mistakes. They also start with very basic vocabulary, they might use the grammar wrong, but it's normal, they are only children. As humans, we only reach adult-like fluency when we're about probably 15 or 16, or even later for some other people. So what you need to take from this is that input and repetition and exposure is super important. So don't just think that children, they just learn it, it's not magic. Another big don't is don't put your child in front of the TV and the radio and just expect them to pick up the language. That will not work. Babies or children in general are human beings. We are social beings. We need to communicate in order to function in society in general. So if there is an actual interaction or communication with a child, then there won't be any bilingualism. However, having some exposure to movies a bit later on, so they still get some regular exposure, is good. But it can't be the only thing. Another thing not to do is to force that language on the child. If you feel like your child is not picking up the language or is not speaking it or refuses to speak it, don't make it a frustrating experience, because it won't help anyone. The child will feel it if it's forced on them, and that will just lead you nowhere. Instead, think of other ways you could kind of implement bilingualism or the other language in their everyday life. Again, the activities I mentioned earlier in the video. Last don't that I want to talk about is do not freak out if you notice that your child starts to mix up the two languages. So, for example, the sentence will be in English, but one or two words will be in French, for example. Do not freak out about this. All bilinguals ever, I've always done it. It's a perfectly normal thing and it's part of the language development. Eventually, the child will be able to differentiate between the two languages, and they will certainly not end up mixing them up when they are older or when they are adults. For example, when I was younger, I use myself as an example because I've been there, but you can ask any other bilinguals or notice it in other bilinguals. When they actually speak to monolinguals or people that speak only one of their languages, they will not mix up. They will notice that the person will not understand the other language, so they will stop using it eventually. And the reason is that children are very smart, they're not stupid, and they will eventually know that if they use the wrong language with certain people, they will not get their message across, or their needs won't be met. They will pick up on that eventually. So do not worry about this, it's perfectly normal, and it should not be discouraged. It's not a bad thing at all. A fourth question that I often see on the internet is, how many languages can children speak or learn when they are younger? And the answer is, there isn't really a limit. Well, in a way. Obviously, it will be more difficult for a child to learn 10 languages when they're young, because learning and understanding 10 languages is a lot of work for a child. So the issue there would be that if the child is exposed to too many languages, it'll be near impossible for them to master all of them because they won't have enough input to actually learn the language. And as I said earlier, a child needs a lot of input to actually know and learn the languages, because language learning starts with a lot of repetition and patience and, just a lot of work. So I would not encourage trying to teach your child too many languages, because it might be that in the end the child will not be able to learn any of them because they won't have enough exposure. Instead, actually focus in the languages that you and your partner speak, or the language that is spoken in the community. In some countries, for example, some children will learn 4 languages when they're young, and that's fine because the language is naturally present in their environment. If the languages are not very present in the environment, then I wonder what is the point of having so many languages. And also, as I said, you need to make sure there is enough exposure. So unless you can manage that, don't do too much. Try to do less and well. So to conclude this video, the 3 things you need to remember is that exposure, need, and input are extremely important. Without exposure, the child cannot learn the language because the child is not exposed to the language. Without the need, the child will eventually not want to speak the language, or they won't see the need to learn it because they can use another language that is more common or more natural in their environment. And input is, like exposure, making sure that the child is spoken to, because otherwise they will not develop their other language. So that's it for the video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave a comment below, and I will see you later. Bye!